She was driving home through the Montana woods when something slammed through her car window. A wild bobcat, terrified and bleeding, landed in the seat beside her. That should have been the end. A rescue, a release, a return to the wild. But when she opened the door to let him go, he stayed. Why? What made this untamed creature choose an old widow's quiet home over the call of the forest? And how did he know before she did that she needed saving just as much as he did? What if the wild doesn't always take? What if sometimes it gives? The morning began as all her mornings did. Steam curled from the chipped mug in Jenna Wilson's hands, its ceramic edges worn smooth from years of sunrise sips. She sat on the creaking porch swing, bundled in Harold's old flannel, watching the light slip slowly across the misted valley. Her land stretched quiet in every direction. Frosted grasses, slumped fence posts, the skeletal silhouettes of distant cottonwoods, the kind of quiet that settled into your bones. The kind that didn't ask for anything but didn't give much back either. It had been 3 years, 3 winters of single-place settings, 3 springs of unspoken conversations with empty rooms. She still left the porch light on, still said goodnight into the dark, still wore the scarf he'd given her, even though the fringe had unraveled, and one end smelled faintly of cedar and dust. At 67, Jenna had grown used to the way grief folds itself into the fabric of your life, not loud, not sudden, just always there, like a second skin. Her companion now was Betty, a rumbling, rust-red 1994 Ford Explorer that wheezed and groaned like an old man but never failed to start. She spoke to it more than she'd admit. Harold would have teased her for it, probably said something about senile witchcraft, and smiled that crooked smile that always reached his eyes first. On that particular morning, Jenna loaded the back of Betty with crates of strawberry preserves. She sold them every Saturday at the Whitefish Farmers Market. It was something to do, something that got her out of the house, something that for a few hours made the silence thinner. The road to town wove through Glacier Creek Valley, a place where pines brushed the sky and sunbeams filtered down like golden breath. Deer were common, occasionally elk, once a bear. But nothing had ever quite prepared her for what came crashing through her open passenger window. It happened so fast. A thud, a blur, a yowl so raw it tore through her chest like broken glass. The car swerved, strawberry jars clattered like angry marbles. Her hands fought the wheel, her heart thundered in her ears. When she finally pulled over to the shoulder, tires grinding gravel, she turned slowly, hands shaking, breath caught halfway between scream and prayer. And there he was, clinging to the passenger seat like a spotted ghost, fur ruffled, eyes wide, panting, a bobcat kitten, maybe 5 months old. No bigger than a loaf of bread, but his paws were too big for his body, a sign of the hunter he'd become. His ears were tufted, black at the tips. His chest rose and fell like he'd sprinted across the stars to get there. He didn't move, neither did she. "Okay," Jenna whispered after a long moment, voice trembling. "Okay, nobody panic." He hissed in response, then tried to disappear into the door panel, his body pressing so tightly against it he looked like a smudge of fear. "I said nobody panic. You're clearly not listening." It should have been a nightmare, but there was something else, something in the way his green gold eyes met hers. Not wild, not quite, not tame either, just trembling, like something had broken off from the world and landed beside her. She reached slowly toward the emergency blanket he'd somehow tangled himself in. He froze, eyes tracking every inch of her fingers. "I'm not going to hurt you," she murmured. "Though you've got sharp little daggers in those feet of yours, I can see that." He didn't strike. He didn't run. He simply watched her unwrap the blanket, as if trying to decide what kind of creature she was. Once free, he didn't bolt. He sat on the floor mat, licking a paw with nervous, rapid strokes. She noticed he was favoring one leg, left front, a bit twisted when he walked. Great, Jenna sighed. A limping wildcat in my car. Harold, if you're watching this, Barky, I hope you're laughing. The rest of the drive home was slow, deliberate, hazard lights blinking like a metronome for the absurd. The kitten, miraculously, didn't cause more chaos. He alternated between cleaning himself and peering out the window like a tiny tourist. Jenna kept talking about the market, about how fall had come early, about how it felt to sleep in a bed made for two. He listened, or seemed to. And when they finally pulled into the driveway, Jenna turned to him and said, "This is the part where you leap out like a proper bobcat and vanish into the brush." He didn't move. She opened the door, thinking the cool air might encourage him, but he didn't flinch, just blinked. That was the moment, the breath before a new chapter, because she didn't push him out, and he didn't ask to stay. He simply did. He didn't bring danger. He brought something Jenna thought she'd lost forever. Jenna opened the passenger door, stepping out slowly into the chilly morning. The world outside was pale with dew, the frost just beginning to lift off the grass. Behind her, the car engine ticked softly. Inside, the bobcat hadn't moved. He stayed where he was, still as a statue, carved from spotted fur and trembling breath. She circled the front of the car, speaking in the low, even voice one might use with a frightened child or a spooked horse. "Okay, fella, we're here. You can go now. Go on." But when she looked in, he wasn't looking at the open door. He was watching her. There was no aggression in his gaze, no wild fury, just a kind of stunned quiet, like something had been knocked loose inside him and hadn't quite settled yet. She crouched beside the doorframe, old knees popping, and rested her arms on the edge. "I can't keep you," she whispered. "You belong out there. That's your place, not this old house. Not with an old woman who talks to jars of jam and forgets where she put her glasses." Still he didn't move. She sighed. "You're not making this easy." It took 15 minutes, 2 cans of Harold's emergency tuna, and a trail of coaxing to get him from the car to the porch. He walked with a stiff sort of determination, limping on his sore leg but curious, sniffing the posts, the mat, the empty boot tray by the door. And when she opened the front door, he stepped inside. Just like that. No drama, no leap, no hesitation. He crossed the threshold with the quiet authority of something that had already made up its mind. Inside, the house was warm. The scent of cinnamon from her morning tea still lingered in the air. Jenna kicked off her boots and watched as the bobcat crept across the entryway, every muscle alert. He moved like a shadow with a pulse, silent but alive. She half expected him to panic, to bolt under the table or up the drapes, but instead he paused. His gaze drifted toward the living room, toward the chair, Harold's recliner. She hadn't sat in it since the funeral, hadn't even moved the throw pillow that sagged a little on one side. It was his place. It had always been. The bobcat padded over to it, sniffed once, deeply, then leapt up with a grace that startled her. He circled twice, like he'd done it 100 times before, then curled into a tight ball right where Harold's head used to rest. Jenna's heart clenched. She stood in the doorway, hand gripping the frame like it might hold her together. Her breath caught in her chest as she whispered, "Oh, Harold, you're really pulling strings, aren't you?" The kitten slept deeply, as if the chair itself had offered him permission to rest. For hours, she didn't move. She sat across from him, cup of tea in her hands, growing cold. watching the way his body rose and fell, listening to the small, rumbly purr that didn't quite match the size of him. She didn't touch him, not yet, but she didn't call anyone either. Not the wildlife officer, not the vet, not the rehab center. Instead, she let him sleep. That night, after an awkward dance involving a shredded chicken breast and her best Corelle plate, the kitten prowled the kitchen like a miniature tiger, licking each piece of meat with a reverence that suggested he'd never eaten anything this good before. He chewed slowly, methodically, then purred with his whole body, louder than any noise she'd heard in weeks. She tried to herd him into the laundry room for the night. "It's safer," she explained, as if he understood. "You need somewhere small, quiet. It'll feel like a den." But the moment she closed the door, the mewling began. Not a demand, not even a protest, just longing. It sounded like someone knocking softly from the other side of a memory. She lasted 10 minutes, then opened the door. He was sitting there, tail wrapped neatly around his paws, looking up at her with a gaze too knowing for a creature so young. "All right," she muttered. "Temporary, just until we figure this out." That night, he followed her down the hallway like a shadow. When she paused at the bedroom door, he brushed past her legs and leapt onto the bed, curling at the foot before she'd even finished turning down the covers. He took the spot where Harold's feet used to rest. Jenna lay beside him in the dark, staring at the ceiling, listening to the rhythmic hum of his breath. And for the first time in 3 years, she didn't dread the morning. She meant to let him rest, not to stay. The days that followed slipped into a rhythm Jenna hadn't planned for. At dawn, he was there. Not just in the house, but with her. Waking before she did, padding quietly down the hall, stretching luxuriously on the rug beside the stove as she made tea. She called him Crash, though it started as a joke. "You crashed into my life," she'd muttered that first morning, watching him chase a speck of dust under the fridge. The name stuck. Crash didn't act like something wild. Not entirely. There was an edge to him, his sudden stillness, the way his ears flicked toward distant sounds. But he watched her, always watched her. And when she spoke, he seemed to listen. He favored the recliner during the day, curling into Harold's dent with a loyalty Jenna didn't have the heart to correct. He chased sunbeams across the carpet, knocked over a vase once, her fault really, for leaving it on the low table, and claimed the windowsill like a throne. But at night, he found her bed, every time. First at the foot, then slowly, creeping closer. By the end of the week, he curled against her ribs, nose tucked beneath her arm. She pretended to protest. "This is temporary, mister. You're not a house cat. You're not mine." But he'd already decided otherwise. Feeding time became a ritual, a quiet bond stitched together by motion and repetition. She learned his preferences: boiled chicken, yes; fish, only in broth; anything canned, a maybe. He'd sit patiently on the counter, watching her prepare his meals with the solemnity of a priest before communion. No begging, no whining, just a soft, steady stare. And afterward, he'd always do the same thing. He'd bring her something, a leaf, a twist of bark, once a pebble, dropped gently at her feet as if offering tribute. "You think I'm your cub?" she laughed one evening, holding up a crumpled oak leaf. "Or your weird human roommate?" He blinked slowly, then walked away with his tail high, the white tip flicking like punctuation. She stopped calling the wildlife center. The number was still on the fridge, scribbled on a yellow sticky note. But the days kept passing, and every day Crash stayed, she found one more reason to let him. She introduced him to the back porch, held the screen door open. He stood at the threshold for a long time, nose twitching. The woods waited beyond, trees dark with shadow. Wind whispering secrets through dry leaves. She expected him to go. He didn't. Instead, he turned, brushed against her leg, and returned to the living room. "You're making a choice," she murmured, and it terrified her, because if he was choosing her, then at any moment he might unchoose her. Crash wasn't tame, not truly. Sometimes he'd vanish into a corner of the house and not reappear for hours. She'd find him behind the dryer, asleep atop Harold's old fishing vest, or crouched in the hall, watching the door like a sentinel. Once, she caught him pawing at the open window, ears perked at the sound of coyotes howling in the hills. That night, he didn't come to bed. She found him curled beneath the kitchen table at dawn, eyes heavy with something she couldn't name. She sat beside him on the floor, knees cracking, hands folded in her lap. "You miss it, don't you?" she whispered. "The wild, the way the stars sound when there's no roof." Crash didn't move. But when she reached out, just barely, he leaned his head into her palm. That was the moment she realized he wasn't staying because he was broken. He wasn't hiding. He was healing, just like her. Their wounds weren't the kind that bled. They were the kind that echoed. One morning, she found him in the garden, sitting beside the scarecrow Harold had built from old jeans and a flannel shirt. He was staring up at it, ears back, tail low. Not afraid. Just curious. Like he was remembering something he'd never seen. She stood on the porch and watched, tears pooling without warning. "You see him too, don't you?" she whispered. Crash didn't turn around, but he stayed beside that scarecrow until the sun touched its straw hat. Then he returned to the house. At night, she told him stories. Stories she used to tell Harold about her childhood in Oregon, about the pie contest she lost in '83. About the way Harold used to leave socks in the freezer when he was sleep-deprived. Crash would lay at the foot of the bed, ears twitching at the sound of her voice, eyes half closed. His presence didn't fill the space Harold had left, but it softened the corners, smoothed the sharpness. He was a question mark with fur. A reminder that not everything needed to be solved. Some things just needed to be held. By the end of the second week, she'd stopped asking when he would leave. She started wondering why he hadn't. He didn't just choose her house, he chose her silence. It happened on a Wednesday. The kind of day that felt too still. The air was thick with a strange expectancy, the sky pale and cloudless, like something had been left unsaid. Crash had spent the morning curled on the windowsill, watching birds dip and vanish into the brush. Jenna had just come in from watering the garden when she saw the truck. Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks. She froze, one hand gripping the edge of the sink, the other damp from the hose. She'd forgotten the follow-up call weeks ago, or maybe she hadn't. Maybe she'd buried it in the same drawer as unopened condolence cards and Harold's last voicemail. The knock was gentle, polite. Two young officers stood on her porch, one with a clipboard, the other holding a transport carrier. Their smiles were kind, practiced. "Ma'am, we're here about the Bobcat." She opened the door just enough to let the air out of the room. "He's asleep," she said. "In my chair?" They hesitated. "We've had reports. Neighbors mentioned seeing him, said you might be keeping him indoors." Jenna folded her arms. "He came to me." "Understood, but he's a wild animal, Ma'am. It's not safe for either of you." She didn't argue. Arguing wouldn't change what was already unraveling inside her. "Give me a moment." she whispered. Inside, Crash was no longer asleep. He was sitting up in Harold's chair, tail twitching, ears tilted. He knew. Somehow he always knew. She crouched beside him, her voice barely audible. "They're not the bad guys," she said. "They'll take you somewhere good. Maybe with other bobcats. Maybe you'll find your kind." Crash blinked, then did something that broke her heart clean in two. He leaned forward and bumped his forehead against hers. Not like a cat, like something older, deeper. Then he stood. But instead of walking to the door, he slinked behind the chair and vanished beneath it. The next 10 minutes were chaos. The officers removed the throw pillows, tried coaxing, then gloves, then nets. Crash didn't attack, but he ran. And in running, he dismantled her world, knocking over the lamp she'd kept since her wedding shower, scattering Harold's reading glasses, sending a trail of paw prints across the quilt she'd stitched during chemo. It wasn't violence, it was grief with claws. Finally, they cornered him in the bathroom. He'd taken refuge in the sink, body low, eyes huge.
Hissing not from hate, but fear. "I'll do it," Jenna said, stepping forward. The officer hesitated. "He could bite. They're not pets." "I know what he is." She stepped into the small room, closing the door behind her. Crash didn't move. She knelt slowly, wincing as her knees cracked. "Hey," she whispered, "it's me, just me." He growled low in his throat, but it broke midway, like even that was too much. She held out her hand, empty, open. "I didn't want it to end like this." He sniffed once, then twice. His nose brushed her fingertips, and in that trembling breath between fear and surrender, she scooped him up, gently, firmly, and pressed him to her chest. He didn't fight, not once. He just breathed. The officer opened the carrier. Jenna hesitated. "Do you know where you'll take him?" "There's a rehab center north of Flathead. They'll assess. If he's healthy and old enough, they'll try to release him. And if he's not, they'll keep him or transfer him. He'll be safe." Jenna nodded, then lowered him into the carrier. He didn't cry. But as the door latched shut, his eyes locked onto hers, wild, green gold, and utterly silent. She didn't look away until the truck disappeared down the road. That night, the house felt different. Not empty, not quite, but still. The windows didn't breathe, the floor didn't creak, the recliner sat untouched.
She made tea and set 2 mugs on the counter, then caught herself. One cup went cold, the other she drank slowly. "You didn't just fall into my car," she whispered to the quiet. "You fell into my grief and made it breathe again." The next morning, the sun rose the same. The birds sang, the pines whispered, but the porch was silent. No paw prints, no chirps, just wind. He didn't look back, but she couldn't look away. 3 days passed, then 5, then 8. Jenna didn't call the center. She told herself it was to give them space. Let the experts do their work. Let Crash adjust. But every night, she watched the tree line from her porch, just in case. She left the porch light on longer than usual, kept the back door unlocked. Small rebellions against reason. The house felt cleaner now, tidier, but that was the problem. It was too clean, too quiet. No knocked-over photo frames. No tufts of fur on the quilt. No soft thud as 4 paws landed beside her in the dark. She told herself he was fine, healthy, released, running through the tall grasses with other wild shapes that never chose human walls. It was what he was meant for. And still, every time the floor creaked behind her, she turned. It had rained the night before, a slow, steady downpour that soaked the fields and turned the porch steps slick. Jenna stayed in bed longer than usual that morning, her joints stiff with the cold. She made tea, fed the birds, sat by the kitchen window with her book open and unread. When she stood to pour a second cup, she noticed something at the back door. A smudge, a print, not boot tread, not her own, a single paw print, slight, smeared in mud, but unmistakably him. Her breath caught. She pushed the door open. The world outside was hushed, soft and grey, steam rising off the earth like breath. Wind stirred the branches. A jay called once, then fell silent. "Crash?" she whispered. No answer. She stepped out barefoot, the cold wood biting up her legs. The garden gate was ajar, the grass bowed in a thin trail, and there, just beyond the edge of her fence, stood a shape. He was thinner, wetter. His ears twitched like antennae. But it was him. Crash stood at the edge of the clearing, halfway between wilderness and home, watching. She took a slow step forward. "You came back." He didn't move, didn't run, he just blinked. She didn't rush him, didn't call. She simply lowered herself to the porch step and waited. Minutes passed. Then he moved, a careful step, then another, a pause, and then he trotted forward, smooth and certain, straight to the base of the steps where he sat, dripping, staring up at her with those eyes that held so much wild and yet so much recognition. She opened the door. He followed. Inside, nothing had changed. Harold's chair, the rug, the faint smell of cinnamon. Crash crossed the threshold like he'd never left. He didn't explore, didn't sniff. He went straight to the recliner, leapt up, circled twice, and settled, right where he used to. Jenna sat across from him, her eyes filled. "I didn't think you'd come back," she whispered. Crash yawned, his body stretching long, his ribs more visible than before. He licked a paw, then stopped, looked at her, and purred. It was quieter than before, but it was there. A sound of home. That night, he didn't wait for invitation. He leapt onto the bed and curled into her side, as if no time had passed, as if the world had only paused for a moment and resumed right where it left off. She didn't ask where he'd been. She didn't need to. His fur told her, knotted, damp, streaked with twigs. His body told her, leaner, more muscle, more edge. But his eyes told her everything else. He had seen what was out there. And still, he came back. The next day, she built something, not a cage, not a room, a space. Near the edge of her land, half hidden beneath the pine, she cleared a corner and built a small wooden shelter. Open on one side, lined with an old fleece blanket, bits of cedar for warmth, half wild, half home. Crash watched her build, never interfering, but always near. That evening, as the sun bled orange across the sky, he lay in the doorway of that little shelter, his eyes catching the fading light. He didn't stay in the house every night now. Sometimes he slipped out after dinner. Sometimes she woke to find his spot cold, the sheets unruffled. But he always returned by morning. He came for breakfast, for warmth, for her voice humming over the kettle, for the chair, for the woman who once said go and meant stay if you need. They found their rhythm again, but now it had breath. Now it had choice. She knew he would leave again someday, maybe for good, maybe not, but for now, he was hers, and she was his. Not because they needed to be, but because they wanted to be. He could have run back to the wild. Instead, he came back to her. The snow came early that year. It dusted the valley in silence, frosting the fence posts and laying soft over the garden where frozen stems of once red tomatoes curled like old hands. Jenna stood by the window, both palms wrapped around a chipped mug, steam rising to blur her reflection. Behind her, the house was warm, humming with the slow breath of winter. Crash was outside, perched atop a stump at the tree line, half in shadow, half in sun. He didn't come in as often now, not every night, not for every meal, but he always appeared at dusk, emerging from the dark with leaves in his fur and stories she would never hear, but could somehow feel. And every time, without fail, he passed by Harold's chair before settling on the rug. A ritual, a pause, as if still checking in with the ghost who once laughed loudest in that room. She watched him from the window. The snow on his back didn't bother him. He blinked slowly, a single flake clinging to his whiskers. And then without warning, he looked up, right at her, not through the glass, at her. Her breath caught, the house held still. And in that moment, everything made sense. He wasn't here to be saved, and she hadn't saved him. They'd met each other halfway, two beings frayed by loss, stitched back together by quiet days and shared space, not to fix what was broken, but to remember what it meant to simply stay. To be, to belong, if only for a little while. That night, she didn't close the door.
She left it cracked, just enough. Not as an invitation, as a memory. He didn't come in, but in the morning there was a single paw print in the fresh snow right outside the threshold. Perfect, pressed, unmoving. Jenna stepped out barefoot, snow cold against her skin. She crouched beside the mark, ran a finger along its edges, then smiled and whispered, "I know." She didn't need to see him to know he was close. The wind shifted, a jay cried from the woods. Somewhere,
beneath the pines, a shape moved, silent, certain. She rose, turned back to the warmth. Behind her, the print remained, where the light had landed. Closing reflection, some creatures aren't meant to stay, and yet they do, just long enough to remind us we're still here. Still capable of connection, still worthy of being chosen, even by the wild. If this story touched your heart, stay close. Here on Paw Prints and Stories, we believe some bonds never end. Some stories don't need words.
just presence.